Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. And not for the first time. I'm getting a bit bored of saying we're doing something different, but guess what, folks? We're doing something different, but genuinely different. We are going to a continent that we haven't really visited properly before. We might have done it sort of fleetingly in terms of Popham and Beresford and Buenos Aires, but we are going to South America for this one. And we're going to focus on one very particularly significant and famous person, Simon Bolivar, who I was just describing to my guest. And I think we basically agreed that his career basically resembles a yo-yo for reasons that will become clear over the course of the next hour. I am joined once again by one of my favorite owners of a ponytail, master of adventures in Historyland, author of Bullock's Grain and Good Madeira, the ever redoubtable Sir Josh Provan. I should probably add further honors and titles to your esteemed nature, but you're looking terribly sort of bashful and embarrassed, and like you're begging me to just shut up and stop dragging out this tortuous introduction. So I will oblige you, Josh, and say welcome to the show. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing pretty well. Things are busy, but we're getting through it. I'm pleased to know that I've had a knighthood attached to the many titles I have accrued over the last 5 years or so. So that's a surprise. That's why it's nice to come back on the show.
Did you make a substantial donation to the Conservative Party?
Hmm. Not that I
Really,
remember.
we probably shouldn't get political on this podcast, should we?
Perhaps
Let
not.
us
Perhaps
move.
not.
Let us move very
I'm more of a
quickly on.
mercenary anyway.
This is true. Right, Bolivar. Oddly enough, hey, let's start at the beginning. But this guy is complicated. I had to prep you questions, and then you had to prep in response to the questions, and we did a lot of head scratching over how the hell you tell the story of this guy. It's incredibly complex because of the whole yo-yo thing. He's in the region, then he gets kicked out of the region, then he's in the region, then he gets forced out of the region, then he goes back to the region. The guy doesn't know when to quit. Effectively, the tenacity is incredible. And you said yourself, the guy lives what, 47 years? That's not a particularly long life. But we will take it back right to the origins. Simon Bolivar, the family that he's born into, what's it like? What do we know about his early life? I mean, he doesn't exactly come up through the gutter, does he?
Not at all. No, he's rich. He's what is termed from a Criollo family, Creole family, i.e., people of, in quotes, pure European blood born in America. The Americas, I should say, but we can get into that bit of nomenclature later. um, yeah, he is, and that is what a criollo is, and that fits into the whole spectrum of the Spanish American designations of blood, um, going down through how much Spanish blood you have, how much native blood you have, how much African blood you have, how much of what percentage of each does everybody have, goes down by skin color, by almost ounces of pigmentation in some cases. Um, that is where he fits into it. So basically, at the top of the only people more important than he is are actual uh, peninsulares, Castilian Spaniards, and therefore his education is very good. His family is wealthy. He gets taught. He gets a liberal education, as they might call it. He also gets, in quotes, finished. He's taught the graces, how to dance, how to talk in polite society, things like that. Um, and of course, as a result of the fact he's a Criollo, he develops, as most Criollos did, a unspoken rivalry with the aristocracy of Spain, but also a desperate, maybe desperate's the wrong word, but a definitive motive to try and be approximate with them, to be recognized as aristocrats by them.
There's a lot for us to unpack there. Um, in terms of the character of that family, you say he gets what's known as a liberal education. I don't kind of associate Spain during this period with liberalism
Mhm.
in a way that even the British of that period would have understood it. And Britain, in that, even liberal Britain in that time, is what is by modern standards a deeply conservative place. Part of that is probably because in Spain, the is it the liberales that
Mhm.
they call them, have a real fight on their hands in the Cortes after the removal of the Spanish monarch by Napoleon. And so that fight kind of really indicates how the liberal argument hasn't won in Spain by
Mhm.
the early 1800s. So when we say a liberal education, how liberal are we talking?
Mhm.
Is he fundamentally from a what we would regard as quite a conservative family, and then it's all things are relative when it comes to liberality?
Mhm. Well, the specific term liberal education, in the way I was intending it, is to say that he was taught the arts, he was taught history, he was taught, lots of things that we take as just education now was thought as liberal then. And this sort of education was the benefit of people who could afford it, enlightened aristocrats and things like that. This is why you send your children on the grand tour, um, etc. Stuff like that. That also means he gets into philosophy. He would get into philosophy and arguments about whether you're the various ancient scholars and things like that. Um, in terms of how his family would have seen their sort of place in the political spectrum, Spanish America is a little bit more hmm, is a little bit more liberal than Spain itself. Now, for a start, since the reign of well, actually, since the Bourbons came into the throne of Spain after the War of the Spanish Succession, you already get an attempt to liberalize the empire, because obviously the Bourbons are French, and so they come in, the sons and grandsons of Louis the XIV, and they try to introduce a lot of modernizing schemes called the Bourbon reforms all the way through the 18th century, reaching its height under the reign of Carlos III, who is thought of as one of the main sort of enlightened despots. Um, Major reforms are attempted in the colonies, and just to try and break the old Habsburg molds of the way things were run, and to try and create a better way of running things that didn't lose them immense amounts of money. Um, Education played a part in this, and by the end of the 18th century, you're getting people like Francisco de Miranda, who was a Venezuelan officer who fought in the American Revolution under de Galvez at the Siege of Pensacola, and he grows up, for instance, and he gets these ideas about in the 1780s, 1790s about independence for the Spanish colonies. This is this is quite a common Criollo mindset. They basically the argument that, okay, right, well, if we're not Spanish, what are we? Um, and a way to, and a lot of them, like Bolivar, who, these people have a lot of time to theorize. They have free time, they have time to think, to write, to read, and so many of them become supporters of reform and of independence at the end of the day. But it is a split thing. It has to be said. Some were more conservative than others, and well, Bolivar himself is an interesting guy for the road he takes.
And you're talking about split. individuals. I mean, there's no greater sort of odd dichotomy to try and get your head around when it comes to Bolivar than the fact that he is El Libertador,
Hmm.
I believe the term is. That's
Yeah.
probably horrifically mispronounced. Um, and he's also a dictator, so liberator and dictator. Now, granted, you can say, well, is Napoleon liberating regions of Europe and then imposing French control over them? So, actually, is that a dichotomy? But it's not what you associate with sort of a liberator and a dictator. Well, not today, anyway. So let's
Mhm.
drill down into his character. What is he like as a person, and why do we see this dichotomy between, hey, let's get rid of the Spanish who are sort of a long way off and telling us what to do and we don't like that, and then replace them with me where I'm going to tell you what to do and give you very little freedom, not unlike the Spanish that we just kicked out.
Yes, these are wonderful topics for entire episodes. Um, okay, so Bolivar, we can get to some of this in the legacy portion, I guess. He is, for these purposes, at the very beginning, he's certainly not a dictator. He is very much the libertador to come. You know, he, however, even then does not start out that way. He is very much a figure in the mold of Zorro, Zorro's alter ego, Don Diego de la Vega. He is a powdered, pampered fop. Um, he's known in his family as being lazy and good for nothing, and they frankly are delighted when they can pack him off to Spain. And he goes to Spain and he charms people. This is not to say that just because there is a rivalry between the aristocracy, like the dons of Spain and the dons of Latin America, that they they don't like each other. Um, Bolivar had a lot of friends in Spain, and he was a very charming man. He was a very handsome man, and he got on well at court to a point until a certain point when he started to get a bit later on when he started to sort of talk politics. He started to offend people, but at the beginning, he went out to Spain with very little kind of focus or drive, or he didn't really know what he was going to do with his life. Nobody knew what he was going to do with his life because he just didn't seem to be interested in much, except being rich. And then he he fell rather madly in love, and in I believe it was 1802 he got married, and he was deliriously happy, and he thought he was going to come back to Venezuela and just learn about how to run the family estates, I guess, have a family, just continue the cycle. But very tragically, his wife died in 1803, not long after getting back to Venezuela, and it completely turned him inside out. And he goes back to Spain. He goes back to Europe almost immediately. I think it's 1804 or something like that. He goes back to Spain, completely heartbroken, completely in bits, um, just questioning how on earth, heaven, fate, the universe can hand him everything and then just take it away. Uh, and so he travels around Europe, and he's not terribly well welcomed exactly in Spain after a point, and he goes to France. And he, at this time, is a big admirer of Napoleon, as many liberals were. He was most certainly developing into a liberal aristocrat, wanting betterment for the lower classes, trying to improve the lives of, his tenants, I guess, back in his estates. And as many enlightened aristocrats and liberal thinkers, what they thought they saw Napoleon as bringing order out of the revolution, a great beacon of democracy, basically in a way, and constitutionalism. And unfortunately, he is gravely disappointed in the fact that Napoleon soon afterwards becomes emperor.
I was literally about to draw the Beethoven comparison in my mind, and I wasn't going to interrupt you.
Yeah,
But as you were saying this, I was thinking, yeah, this is that phase where it's pre-crowning of crowning himself of emperor, as emperor, I should say, and it's in that bit where you can kind of look at what Napoleon's doing and nod and go, well, okay, by modern standards, we look at the code and go grossly misogynistic. Also, there's quite obviously the howler that is the situation regarding slavery, and yet, broadly speaking, the code does a lot of good for French society. You've got stability, you've got the peace. It's in that phase, right, where you look if Napoleon stops in sort of mid 1804, you can kind of go, yeah, no, pretty impressive, liking some of this. And then you get the emperor thing. Beethoven famously scratches the dedication out. In fact, he tears the page in the process. Such was his fury. So interesting that Bolivar has that similar kind of reaction, that kind of sense of betrayal. But anyway, I've interrupted you mid-flow.
well, I see from the question sheet I've kind of leached into the next question itself about how Bolivar becomes revolutionary. And
Yes, but shush, never mind. We just won't tell anyone about that.
okay, this was all planned. The but yeah, he's very disappointed in Napoleon. And in fact, he writes very strongly about pretty much how he hates him now. That he betrayed everything that was good in what had happened since 1800 practically. And this is not to say that because Napoleon and the whole I'm emperor thing could be seen by certain constitutionalists as still okay, right? Technically it was just another coup. He got himself in power. Everybody, people have been doing that in France for a few decades now. And all right, it seems to be the will of the government, whoever is pulling the strings, that we do a constitutional monarchy. And honestly, a lot of like a sort of liberal conservatives, you might call them, across Europe probably nodded their heads and said, well, Britain has sort of that, so all right. But Bolivar by this point was turning full Republican, maybe not Jacobin, but properly. Why on earth do we have kings? The king in Spain, the guy I'm supposed to be a servant of, is an idiot, and his son is a rat, and I hate everything about the system in Spain that I've seen. And he ends up going to Rome with his old tutor, and they climb the Aventine Hill. And Bolivar, who is now fully searching for cause and meaning in his life after the death of his wife, throws himself into basically he just spits it out. He vows that he will not rest until he expels the Spanish from America. He just does this in Rome. I mean, what his tutor, I believe his name was Simon Rodriguez or something like that, must have thought at this point was like, okay. But
Are
this is
you
the thing
suggesting
with
this is sort of
Bolivar.
one of those "Are you feeling okay, hun?" kind of moments? Because that's the vibe inverted commas that I'm getting from you right now.
It's just it's a very important moment in sort of the legend of Bolivar, and it seems to have happened. And in a life that is replete with moments where he just says things that seem to almost be intentionally designed to echo through history, this is the thing that starts it off. Standing on a hill in Rome with a few friends, and he vows to rid his country of the Spanish Empire.
So we've talked a bit about Venezuela within the context of this, which immediately some folks are going to go, well, hang on, Simon Bolivar, Bolivia, why are we talking Venezuela? We'll get there, people. It's a whole thing. That's literally part of the point of this episode. We shall explain. However, we'll focus on Venezuela for the moment. What's it like at this point in time? And you've sort of alluded to this a little bit already, but I think it's worth digging a little bit. From what you're saying, it's not a kind of new Spain. It's not let's transplant Spanish culture to the letter into the inverted commas new world. It seems to be sort of culturally distinct. So just give us a bit of context on that.
Yeah, Bolivar himself later in his life, when he was arguing with people about why he was becoming a little bit more dictatorial than he was becoming sort of democratically liberal, was to say he argued basically that it's all well and good for the people in North America and the United States to do what they're doing, but the people down here are completely different, and we've been run completely different for 300, 400 years. And it's very interesting when he starts getting into writing political pamphlets and books and letters and things about how he sees history. Um, and reason he sees history the way he does is because of where he's from. Uh, Venezuela and the Spanish colonies are distinct in certain ways, and the most notable being the diversity of the population. And the mixture of Africans, as I said at the beginning, indigenous South and Central Americans and Spaniards, all combining to create distinct cultures across the continent. Even though they all promise at this stage to be loyal subjects of the King of Spain, you're still dealing with something that is companion to, Madrid. You have different customs and laws and ways of interacting with each other, that many of which are still, especially for like the upper classes, based on Spanish models of aristocracy and understanding. And obviously the church is still very important in day-to-day life, but it's the difficulty of running the place is just simply because there's too many factors at play, too many motivations from different sides. And as Bolivar, like I said at the beginning himself, said, it's very difficult to unify these people basically with single abiding ideas of being one nation when you all come from various different places. He said that we are more connected to Africa and America than we are to Spain. We're more Indians and Africans, the majority, he said. And this is one of the most important parts to grasp when you get into his sort of political motivations and arguments and things. And he absolutely begins to distance himself and everybody else from the Spanish model and say that they're all conquistadors and we're all Indians and things like that. This is the thing that, for the purposes of this podcast, is probably useful to know. And when you're talking about the colonies in the 18th and early 19th century.
So what's coming through quite strongly from what you're saying is that, the reception he gets when he sort of rocks up and goes, yeah, independence, how about it, is interesting. There's this sort of sense of, yeah, do you just want to go away?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, I mentioned this guy before, Miranda. He had already tried um to come back with an army with North American money to win freedom for his country. Bearing in mind that Venezuela was a part of the larger viceroyalty kind of subdivision of New of Spain, of the Spanish Empire, that they called New Granada. But yeah, the feeling was that Miranda had come and tried, and he was like the most famous revolutionary in from South America. He was famous across Europe. He'd commanded French armies. He'd become he'd become Catherine the Great's bit of stuff. And he was in exile, famously preaching about the woes of tyranny and things like that. And so when Bolivar comes back in 1807, the feeling is certainly one that basically Venezuela, Caracas has we said we're not bothered. We're okay with the king. We're okay with being the colony. It's not a big deal. Um, but Bolivar had been to Europe, and it was not the case that everybody thought this way. Certainly, the criollos were of they were definitely split amongst sort of the younger, brasher ones like Bolivar, who had a lot of ideas about independence, and older ones who want to just keep the status quo. Let's keep our estates, let's keep our money, let's keep on the good side of the king. And he and Bolivar is one of the ones that comes back with a particular drive. He's still inexperienced and everything like that, but he is rich, and he knows how to speak to people. He knows how to win friends and influence people, so to speak. And so he immediately appealed to this younger demographic of people who wanted to discuss new ideas and radical ideas, indeed, about liberty and equality and stuff. And these ideas for like the older generation were not things you talked about, really, not things you wanted to encourage talk about, because they were pretty much afraid that they would just start a race war if they started to just talk about liberalizing and freedom and things like that. And so Bolivar had to, and his Bolivar and his friends who wanted to talk and plan about these big ideas had to do so somewhat covertly. And he organized Republican meetings amongst supporters, and they would pretend that they were meeting to discuss art and literature and things like that. There would be these societies with long-winded names about various things like that. One of them, I'm pretty sure, was some sort of society that was sort of the I don't know, the liberal society for like the the I don't know, the progress of, I want to say, like livestock and agriculture or something like that. And under the guise of these meetings, they would talk about like tearing the king down and things like that. um, but at this point, there was little else that could be done except plot and wait for something to happen, because there just wasn't the impetus, there wasn't the cause. The cause hadn't been birthed yet, really.
And funnily enough, a cause appears to get presented on a silver platter because, as regular listeners and fans of the period know, 1808 comes along. Napoleon tries to annex Spain in all but name. It doesn't go particularly well for him. Spoiler alert. For more on that, you might want to listen to the redoubtable Josh Provan discussing the Peninsular War with me as part of a new series. There will be more installments of that incoming very soon. And we get, funnily enough, the Peninsular War off the back of it all. And it's very tempting. And certainly before I looked into it prior to prepping this episode, I was one of these people who would have done this. It's very tempting to draw a sort of direct line from that to Venezuelan independence. However, it's not an automatic process because the early attempts are seriously botched, aren't they?
They are, and I said before, Miranda had tried one in 1806, and that had been an utter mess. With all of his men being captured, pretty much, and he had to run away in exile again. And he was at this moment writing letters, trying to get people to try again. Especially when Napoleon kicks the door in Spain. You obviously have the fact that you're dealing with quite a lag in information. Um, the the news that the monarchy had been overthrown didn't even reach Venezuela until July of 1808. And what happened there was that a the criollos formed a junta, but because they were still technically swearing allegiance to the king, this really wasn't what it seemed to be. This was just basically them saying, just like they did in Spain, this is just them saying the government has been overthrown by a foreign invader and we need to derive authority from somewhere, so we need to form this temporary government so we can continue onwards. And of course, however, this seems like the perfect opportunity for radical Republicans, however, to start getting the elbow in and saying, well, since we're here and since we now have this power, maybe we should make some changes. But at the time, Bolivar wanted no part of any government he was inexperienced, remember, he was just a hothead at this time. And he wanted no part of a government that was still loyal to the king, because again, he had seen the court in Madrid. He didn't like any of it. When the junta was done away with, which was pretty much as soon as the authority of the general junta of Seville reached the country, again, you have another delay where the new Spanish government gets in charge and starts appointing its own guys. A lot of members were then arrested or sent packing because they had, they were no they were just sort of, they were liabilities. So it's all very confusing already. Now, the Venezuelan criollos and those of the other colonies mostly welcomed the opportunity presented by Napoleon's intrusion into Spain, but had nothing but scorn for the emissary sent out by Joseph Bonaparte specifically. So it's like, okay, we didn't like the way that Spain was running things before. Yay, Napoleon's given us an opportunity to change things. Even the conservatives were kind of like, well, this might be a good thing. But when Joseph Bonaparte sends emissaries out saying, I'm the king of Spain and I now rule all of Latin America as well, they were just like, you're having a laugh. No, that's not going to happen. And so in 1809, you get Marshal Vicente Emparin. He arrives as Captain General, appointed by the Junta de Seville, and he brought with him Bolivar's brother-in-law, Fernando del Toro. Now, this presented Bolivar with possible leverage, as he had traveled around Spain with Fernando on his tour. However, the first signs of separation did not come from Caracas, despite, this is definitely the door opening. But actually, it was about 1,000 miles to the southwest in Quito, in modern Ecuador, which just goes to show that, there was these sort of liberalizing ideas sparking across Latin America just by dint of people thinking about how things were run and why they were run that way. And what was called the El Primer Grito de Independencia, the criollos of the city proclaimed their independence in August of 1809, and Bolivar's party was at that time becoming stronger. In January of 1810, news arrived in Caracas of the Junta of Seville fleeing to Cadiz from one of Bolivar's endless string of informants, and that the junta intended to reform the entire social and political structure of the empire into a more inclusive and liberal model. Of course, this was what Seville was absolutely basically trying to head off Napoleon, saying, I am the great reformer, I am going to give you freedoms. And they're saying, well, we'll do that, and we're Spanish. So, don't rebel. Don't let the French in. We need your money. So Bolivar put little store into these promises, but the important news was the Spanish Regency was actively seeking to court the colonies. And on the 19th of April, 1810, the Liberal Party overthrew the Spanish colonial government in a bloodless coup, and proclaimed the sovereign but still loyal junta, revoking slavery trade restrictions, Indian tribute at a stroke, and Buenos Aires, Bogota, Quito, and Mexico all followed suit in some manner or another over the course of the year. So yeah, it was a very gradual thing. Um, didn't immediately say, yeah, let's all rise up and take control here. There was a lot of politicking going on, but eventually you do get this snap where sort of the Republicans basically rise up and say, let's just go independent here, see where this takes us.
But it's not an easy process, right? We're kind of reaching 1811 in the story now. You've got royalist armies, you've got earthquakes, defections. It all seems to be quite heavily stacked against them.
Yeah, to some degree, yeah. I mean, it's all well and good for them to sort of take advantage of Napoleon messing around in Spain and the attempts of the Spanish to try and manage this. But it's a completely other thing to basically say that, we have taken control of our own country. We're not just accepting your dignitaries. In fact, we're going to kick your dignitaries out and we'll still help you out because we're all loyal servants of the king. But we it's Venezuela for the Venezuelans and God save the king kind of thing still. Um, so in 1811, the moderate Criollo party gets sidelined by the radicals. After the coup, Bolivar, who reluctantly had to accept that the moderate plan had worked, had offered his services, and the moderates mistrusted him, and but they needed his money and connections because he was rich, and they sent him to London. Basically, his early life is a little bit like what do we do with this guy? Could we please get him out of the country? That was what his family had wanted at the beginning, and this is what his government wanted in 1811. They sent him to London on the mission to try and get money and troops to help them basically stay independent. And this is the and Miranda is already in London, stoking up fires. He's very excited about an idea of the British actually sending troops to South America, to Venezuela, and although unfortunately the timing is rather bad because by this point, because they arrived in July of 1810, so by that point the British in the just an inextricably confusing sequence of events. It's really wonderful in a way to look at things from the Spanish American perspective because you get a whole new idea about what other people saw Napoleon as, what other people wanted the British for, what the heck is going on in Spain is given a completely different texture. Um, anyway, they get there going to try and say, "Hey, Britain, we know that you're enemies of Spain. Well, we'd like to be free. Could you help us out?" And the British are going,
I mean, like you say, the timing is less than ideal. Do it, I don't know, 24 months earlier, and sure, maybe somebody will hear you out. But by that point, the Peninsular War's been going 2 years. Britain is quite visibly committed. Okay, it's 1810. So, sure, Wellington has pulled back post Talavera and he's on the Portuguese border and he's focused on the defense of Portugal and so not heavily involved in Spain or even really involved at all. But that's not to therefore indicate that the Brits have gone, now we don't care about the Spanish. We'll definitely be up for, riling them up. Now that we've got this extra ally against Napoleon, we'll just squander that and, promote
"Mhm."
this other cause. It's a very odd
It's just
rationale.
it's just bad luck, really. I mean, when they went off, they didn't really realize that the British would be going to be taking advantage of this situation. In fact, the British, I believe, the Royal Navy officers who are currently in the Caribbean, had been one of them at least had been assuring the Venezuelans, I believe, that the British, were enemies of Spain and you could count on our support, kind of thing. He didn't know squat either. Um, But by this point, actually, Miranda had already been yelling at the future Duke of Wellington in the street when Arthur Wellesley had told him very politely that, sorry, actually, my army's going to Spain to help your enemies, um, kick the French out.
Because that's always known to go well, yelling at
Oh
Arthur
yes,
Wellesley,
there
future
was.
Duke of Wellington.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, Arthur Wellesley walked away. He just sort of he was getting embarrassed, so he just walked away. But yeah, the this as well, by the way, though, is kind of what happened with this embassy because they go to meet Richard Wellesley, who is, I want to say, I think he's the foreign secretary or secretary of war or something like that. I've forgotten his title, but he's the point man in the cabinet who's supposed to deal with this Venezuelan embassy. They meet in Apsley House, and Bolivar just goes completely mental. He goes on this massive speech in front of Richard Wellesley about how he's going to that how Venezuela is going to go completely independent, go completely republic, throw off the Spanish. And Richard Wellesley's just sort of going, "What? Yes, wonderful idea. I can see what you're saying. Help from us at this time. Time's a little difficult, though. I'm sure you understand. Um, we'll get back to you." Uh, so the long and short of it is that Bolivar teams up with Miranda, which was something he was explicitly told by the government not to do, and arranges to return with the conquering hero and savior of liberalism and the darling of the Republican set to go back to Caracas with Miranda and just sort of establish this new government, this new nation. They go back, and it's in 1812, and things are kind of going okay because Miranda's kind of a popular guy. It makes sense that he would be involved in trying to do this. But then, of course, like you say, on the 26th of March, 1812, you get a devastating earthquake that slams the Caracas area, ruins most of the city, and kills about 8,000 people in the immediate surroundings, and possibly between 30 to 120,000 people from the coast to the Andes. So, although you do have the beginnings of sort of a constitution in Caracas and sort of the nucleus of a new nation, it's immediately slapped in the face by nature, and um, it's just a terrible time to have to deal with that.
is it that the earthquake accelerates the decline of something that's already pretty precarious, or does nature sort of genuinely kick the legs out from underneath this movement and hand a kind of a God sent opportunity to reassert control by the inverted commas loyalists, i.e., those loyal back to the Spanish government slash Spanish monarchy, however you want to package that?
Mm. Well, I mean, obviously, natural disasters are things we can't control, and as we've seen very recently, that is absolutely the case in the case, say, as in Turkey. But they do affect us very deeply. They have the power to both show us where we're strong and where we're weak. Now, the quake laid bare the divisions of the Republican government completely, and just reduced the armed manpower to a very dramatic extent. The armed troops, who were supposed to be defending the Republic, took the very heavy casualties just from the earthquake as well. And the Spanish general Monteverde wasted no time in gathering his own troops and marching on the stricken capital. And frankly, the Republicans were just utterly finished at this point. They didn't have troops to defend the capital with. Everybody was in confusion. Everybody was in uproar. Nobody was leading. Miranda was not showing any sort of leadership or guidance. Bolivar um, came out quite well because he was down in the streets with everybody. He was digging through the rubble to rescue people personally. But that's that's neither here nor there when when the royalists are coming to put an end to the government. Um, Now the Miranda is offered the role of dictator, and of course he accepts the job, but he doesn't have the means of really doing anything. He puts up a creditable defense before deciding that the cost of fighting to the death is not worth it, and the end result uh, was that he retreated, pretty much took out all of this, a great deal of the savings of the new government, and tried to escape to the coast. He was then arrested by Bolivar and other officers and declared a traitor. Um, and in the late summer, basically, they've arrested their own head of state. They don't have an army left to fight. The Spanish are coming down the road, and well, they have to. Everybody has to flee. The greatest loser in this particular segment of the disastrous early history of Venezuela is the fact that Miranda is locked up and then captured by the Spanish. He's locked up by his own side and he's captured by the Spanish, and he is sent to Cadiz, where he will die in 1816, out of sight and out of mind, pretty much. That's the tragedy of Francisco de Miranda. But Bolivar has to escape, and everything has just gone to pot in the most dramatic possible.
So the money's gone, one of the figureheads is gone, and yet Bolivar isn't done. Um, because he's back the following year. You know, this is the comeback tour almost of this story. So he goes to New Granada this time. Why there as opposed to Venezuela, where he'd previously done the bulk of his work?
So it's kind of confusing because New Granada technically means Venezuela too. But at some point, um, yeah, so New Granada is a Spanish administrative district that had once included Colombia, what became Colombia, and therefore part of Venezuela too. Um, Venezuela was made into a captain generalcy in 1777, so theoretically it's different from New Granada, but technically still subservient to New Granada. It's like the relationship between Mexico and Cuba in the Spanish imperial system. Um, it gets its own captain general, which is obviously better than governor, but it doesn't have a viceroy. New Granada has the viceroy. Anyway, so it is a different thing, but the same thing. And so, although the Spanish had regained control over the Venezuelan captain generalcy, they did not have control over New Granada, which, as I said before, many districts across South America had also said, we're independent now, bye bye Spain. And it was New Granada that gave him sanctuary, Bolivar sanctuary, when he fled, because there was still a lot of territory in Republican hands. The government gave him a modest garrison command, and being Bolivar, as soon as he gets settled, he starts writing proclamations. He issues the Cartagena Manifesto, which tells everybody, I know what went wrong before, and basically, all you lovers of freedom and liberty, come and join me because we're going to go and drive the Spanish out of South America. He just uses it as a second. He says, "I'm still alive. I still have ability to get to the presses. Someone here can give me some money and some troops, and as long as I have those things, I will continue the fight."
So he's back, and he's the same but different, but really the same. And then goes on a bit of a rampage because you've got an invasion of Venezuela, the decree of war to the death, because that's not even remotely insane in its implications. There are slave revolts, there's a power struggle, and then guess what? And this is where the yo yo thing really comes in. He's exiled again. So he's in, then he's out, and then he's in, and then he's out. And all of that happens in the space of 3 years. So help us make sense of that madness.
I can do my best. I don't think I can promise very much.
Good
Um,
luck.
what happens is that Bolivar actually has great success with a small army that first secures the Magdalena River, from where he gets permission to properly invade Venezuela in 1813. And he embarks on what is called his admirable campaign, where he kicks off by issuing the Decreto de Guerra y Muerte, which is the intention to take no prisoners. Any Spaniard not actively supporting his own forces will be killed, and he's really committed to this. Um, atrocities are actually perpetrated because of this manifesto. That being said, the same manpower shortages that did for the First Republic are problems that are still plaguing, I should say, manpower and supply of shortages that are still plaguing Venezuela. And between Bolivar and the Republican commander in the east, Santiago Marinho, the Republicans are able to recapture Caracas by August of 1813. They drove Monteverde out by October, and Bolivar was proclaimed dictator of the Second Republic in January of 1814. And when he entered Caracas, people met him in the streets, cheered him because they remembered him as the young nobleman who was hauling fugitives out of the rubble, and saying, "I know who the traitors are." um, he was hailed, like said, "Viva el Libertador," and stuff like that. "Viva Bolivar." Um, and so everything was looking pretty rosy. The problem is that there is no breathing space for political unity. Mourinho has no reason to accept Bolivar as his leader, and the people are still basically unsatisfied with the Republican constitution. They're unsatisfied with everything. They don't like the Spanish, and the Republicans aren't really helping them out either. They're just saying a bunch of flowery words. And the armies, more importantly, are eating all of their food. This allowed a resurgence of popular unrest, and the royalists were able to rally and return to the attack. I should say, you mentioned slave revolts and things like that. You're getting counter revolts against the revolutionaries because they're still not giving a good deal to people of color, to indentured servants, to slaves, even to Indians. They're giving measures and not really sort of doubling down on them, you know. So that basically says to them, well, that technically means we're just as well off with the Spanish, and they seem to have all the money. So, what give us a better offer. And so the royalists now return to the attack. They're aided by a very significant factor now, because they are aided by robust bodies of local troops, such as the excellently named Legion Infierna, the Legion of Hell. These people these were all cavalry army of what are called llaneros, from the llanos. Llanos means plains. These are the plains of Venezuela. These are cowboys, but the toughest cowboys you have ever heard. They're a mix of like Comanche warrior and like cow herder. And
So definitely not John Wayne then.
oh no, I mean they probably would have made John Wayne very scared. These people were really if you want to, as will become clear as anybody who reads about the War of Liberation, the Llaneros become the decisive factor pretty much. Whoever gets them on their side starts to win, because they're sort of like the Mongols of Latin America. Once they get going, it's really difficult to deal with them. And these guys are led by a ferocious royalist caudillo, which is sort of like basically a strong man, word for a strong man, called Jose Thomas Boves. And literally, I mean, this guy is like the Latin American Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun kind of guy. And he just rampages through the Republic. And they retake, the royalists retake Caracas, they drive out Mariña, and Bolivar had to run back to New Granada, losing all of the treasure he had salvaged from Caracas. Things then go from bad to worse now because they're getting into 1815, and oh yes, look what's not happening anymore: the Napoleonic Wars. Um, and oh, that means the Spanish can start sending over some fairly tough soldiers to start dealing with all of this nonsense in the colonies. And because, yes, as Bolivar and the others noticed, Ferdinand VII is an awful human being and will repeal all the constitutional promises of the central juntas of, how many other Cadizes and Sevils and how many other iterations it went through. And he sends over a guy called Pablo Murillo, a one-time Marine soldier, peasant, who had risen through the ranks to become a general who fought at Victoria under Wellington. And he was a real piece of work, by the way, when he got into Latin America. Even the Spanish had to say, "Stop it with the atrocities already, okay? It's looking bad for us." Um, but he shows up with 8,000 men and topples the government of New Granada. He takes Bogota. He takes the safe zone that Bolivar had fled to, and leading. And so this leaves things pretty much worse for the Republicans than before. Actually, they lose even more this time round.
Yeah. The conclusion of the war for Spain, at least in 1814, does kind of leave them open to send some pretty battle-hardened veterans the way of Bolivar and New Spain, if you like. Um, but he's not done. Oh no. And so, admittedly, right, we're going beyond the confines of 1815, the usual cutoff for this show. But actually, when you tell Bolivar's story, you can't stop in 1815 because most of the ultra interesting stuff happens post 1815. So, with that in mind, there's a bit of a shift in focus for him, isn't there? I mean, it's almost as though he kind of comes to the realization this hasn't worked, so why don't we try something different? Because he's more moderate in his approach. There's a greater focus on building a power base, which, if you're going to strategize, is usually quite a good idea in terms of how you plan your campaign. So, how does he begin that process of trying to rebuild and consolidate?
So it's a massively long road to get to 1819. We should say, for the Republicans. Most of it is a baffling list of failures and make you wonder how this guy can just keep coming back, because you've heard of all the failures up to this point. Well, they keep coming. Um, the dude just ends up enlisting support from the president of Haiti this time round. This time he casts his net to the new republic in the Caribbean, whose name is Alexandre Pétion. And in return for a promise to emancipate South American blacks, Pétion basically says, "Well, I'll fund your war." And so this backing is really where the impetus for the next try comes from. But to cut a long story short, although he does attempt to be more measured, he does repeal, and I don't know if he publicly repeals it or just decides himself, but he does repeal the Decreto de Guerra Muerte, and he makes some important allies. Very importantly here, as I said before, he makes an ally of a chap called Jose Antonio Paez, who is the new caudillo in the Llanos. He's known as the El Centaur de los Llanos, the centaur of the plains. He's the new head man of these crazy, crazy plainsmen, cowboy people. And he is open to offers about who to support. And supposedly there's this sort of legend one of the legends around them is that he needs to be impressed by Bolivar, and so he sets tests for him uh, to pass. So, and if he passes these tests, then I'll be on your side. And Bolivar, it should be remembered, is a quite a sickly, skinny, short guy who does not look particularly impressive to most people, especially after he's been campaigning a lot and he hasn't been eating and sleeping and stuff. He doesn't look like a very healthy man. Um, and the last test is this absurd horse race, which is supposed to basically go on until I guess the horses drop. Um, and Bolivar completes it, and Paez is just like, I mean, fair play, man. Okay, I'll be on your side. You seem to be you seem to you seem to know you seem to be tough enough to back your words with action. I like a man like that. And he called him, because of this last test, he called him Iron Ass.
This sounds like the plot from the new Hogwarts Legacy game. You know, can you prove your worthiness by completing a series of quests that will
Yes.
develop your ability as a human being and prove your righteousness in order for me to entrust you with this, powerful force
Mhm.
that can be unleashed. It's really quite bizarre.
It's incredibly bizarre, and this is the sort of stuff you're dealing with at this point. It's straight out of some sort of fairy tale. This is a very, again, this is one of the sort of the key things about his legacy, his myth, that he would put his money where his mouth was, and he had this strange reserve of strength and energy that allowed him to do things that he shouldn't have been able to do. Whether it's true or not, Paez does come on his side, and he gets therefore a really strong, tough group of troops that he can now count on.
Is there evidence to suggest that just a substantial amount of money might have changed hands and that might have been the key?
That might have been the key too, and I would love it if that was. I would love it if Paez actually had basically just set him all these torturous things, and and then at the end it was just like, right, well, you just pay me the money, then we'll get things done. But what you also get is by the same token is the fact that the Spanish can now send regular troops who've been supplied and trained by the British and everything like that over to fight. You get a lot of British soldiers that are out of work because the British do the thing that the British do and they start disbanding everybody. That means actually that thousands of British soldiers end up forming into downright illegal legions, privately funded legions, and sail over to South America. They form the British Legion in Bolivar's army. And these guys, led by officers who fought through Spain, soldiers who fought through Spain, end up in South America fighting with Bolivar for Colombia. And there are some excellent books and memoirs about this.
Every day's a learning day. You should see my face right now. But anyway, let me shut up and allow you to carry on.
Yeah, well, the main positive of these years is gaining those allies and control of the Orinoco River, and therefore developing a stable power base again. Um, Republican command is still factionalized between Bolivar and Mariña, and the power dynamics between the two mean that no progress can be made past a certain point. Also, you're getting the problem that Bolivar is an instinctive and theoretical soldier, not a trained and practical one. And sometimes this is good, but in the advance on Caracas in 1818, he defeats Murillo at Calabozo in February, only to be defeated himself in March. So it's always a back and forth thing. And he has to retreat again back to the Orinoco. However, this time he stays on the mainland and is able to shore up his political position, rest his army, and make a new plan.
And that plan is where you sort of get this proper turning of the tide, right? Because you get the crossing of the Andes, the creation of Colombia. So talk us through not only what happens, but why does it work this time when we're really starting to emphasize this yo-yo element that he's been backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And okay, this time, yes, he's managed to retain a power base, but it is this sense of almost one step forward, two steps back. I mean, in this particular instance, it's been one step forward, well, two steps forward and one step back. But what is different this time?
I honestly don't know.
This is the joy of podcasting. I hope you don't mind. We're going to leave that in.
Yeah, no,
Um,
no, absolutely. I mean, it's true. It's true. Technically, nothing meaningful, up to the point where he starts to win after he crosses the Andes. Um, Nothing has changed from this stalemate that develops between him and Mauricio. You have Paez. He's basically using Paez to now just pin down the Spanish and keep them occupied while he figures out what to do next because he just can't make headway. And so he maintains his presence in opposition, but you can't. I mean, you could. I'm sure a lot more reading would absolutely reward me with the answer as to what changed that allowed him to do this. But to be honest with you, I'm scared to say that flying in the face of all logic and historical method, and what we are told are the things that win battles and campaigns. The Bolivar was making it up as he went along, and this plan worked because he kind of knew now that Venezuela was kind of a poisoned chalice to whoever held it. Whenever he had taken it and held it, he immediately lost thereafter. So you get the sense that he saw that the Spanish held Venezuela, and he says, "Well, all right, I'll let you suffer with that for the second because it's starving and has no money, and Caracas is a pile of rubble. And I'm gonna let my crazy, scary horseman dude run around and scare you. And meanwhile, um, I'm gonna cross the Andes into New Granada and take Bogota." And everybody is just like, "Sorry, what? Cross the what now?" Yes, Bolivar decided on quite short notice, as far as I can figure out, a new, brilliant, indirect, and utterly ludicrous plan to take his army, march it over what is called the Cordillera of the Andes, 13,000 feet.
I
Um,
was about to say, this is not Napoleon crossing the Alps. 13,000 feet, people. I've flown a plane at 2,000 feet. I have flown a plane at 2,000 feet.
mhm,
This guy is walking at 13,000 feet, six and a half times that, with an army
mm.
that doesn't, as far as I recall, have the greatest supply chain known to human history.
This is the thing that I don't understand. He doesn't have the logistics to do this. But yet, in the summer of 1819, when it's even worse in the mountains because there's rain as well, he does it by sheer force of will and personality. Almost, he just says, "We're going to march over this," and improvises everything on the way. I mean, Paez says, "I am not, and I repeat, not taking my horses over the Andes, you madman." And he doesn't. He stays down on the plain because, and Bolivar's really angry that he won't follow him on the suicide march over the Andes. But and there is a point to this. Bolivar loses 2,000 men crossing the Andes. It's a disastrous thing to do. It shouldn't have worked. But because it's such a stupid thing to do, nobody expected it to happen. And he
Is this thing of sort of fight the enemy where they aren't?
yes,
I
pretty
mean, I
much.
know that's
Yeah.
sort of got a sort of Sun Tzu kind of mentality to it, but go where people really aren't expecting you because it is just a plan that nobody would realistically
Mhm.
propose. And because of that, when he gets over to the other side, things are that bit easier.
They are, yes. He gets over to the other side. There's only one Spanish sort of army out there, and they're not as tough as Murillo's men. Um, and he marches on Bogota. There's a initial battle where he gets over the Andes and his men are in rags and they're starving and everything like that. This was the point where the Spanish had a really good chance to take him out. Um, and in the first battle, it's called the Battle of Pantano de Vargas. They almost rout him, and he starts to lose his cool, and he turns around and he says aloud, "All is lost." But next to him is a guy called Colonel Rondon, and he's one of the few Llanero captains who followed him over the Andes. And he sort of hears him bemoan his fate, and he says, "Oh, my general, why are you saying that? My men haven't attacked yet." Bolivar is incapable of doing anything in a crisis situation that does not sound like it was scripted in a movie. He immediately turns to Rondon and says, "Colonel, save the Republic." Rondon turns to his men, draws his sword, and says, "The brave may follow me," and charges. And the Spanish are broken and flee.
So the other day we had news breaking of the fact that Steven Spielberg is working with HBO to produce a 7 episode series on Napoleon's life, hard on the heels, one suspects, of Ridley Scott doing a film on Napoleon's life that is now called Napoleon and Not Kitbag. I do kind of wonder why somebody hasn't picked up this story and just gone, I don't really need to write much of a script because it's written for me. This is crazy. I mean, if
It
I didn't
isn't
know you, Josh, I would probably be listening to this thinking this guy just made this up. I'm not sure that I'm going to have this guy back, but it's you, so I know you do your due diligence. It's crazy.
the newest books about Bolivar all mention this stuff, and I don't know if it's just because they can't help it because it's such good, right, like material for consumption or something. But most people seem to think that it is in his character to say the right thing at the right time and just be incredibly lucky. This charge, for instance, it just happens at the right moment, and the Spanish are pushed back. And then not too long after that, you get the decisive battle at the Battle of Boyaca, where he actually completely devastates the Royal Army. He loses like 70 men or something, like inflicts 2,000 casualties, and he then heads for Bogota. One of his officers noted that a lightning bolt does not fall from the sky as fast as Bolivar marched on Bogota, and he yeah, forget Napoleon, all right? Forget Napoleon. I don't care. Um, Bolivar, do Bolivar for heaven's sake. There's been plenty of movies about him in Spanish, but he deserves something big from Hollywood because it's just too good.
But there's a problem for us, Josh. He's not done yet because
No, it's not.
having I mean the guy almost tires me out just talking about him. So he's created Colombia, having kicked the Spanish to pieces with this mad strategy of, hey, let's cross the Andes. And then goes on to deal with Ecuador and Peru.
Mm.
Why doesn't he seem to just stop? I mean, in fairness, and this is a point to kind of get serious, he does get asked. Well, he asks permission to keep going, right? And that permission is granted. But why is there this inclination to just keep stretching in terms of spreading his influence? Because you do look at this and think, well, don't the stories of the previous campaigns indicate that need to pause, consolidate? Look, you're chasing odds here that shouldn't work on paper, and yet somehow they do.
Yeah, but so he takes New. I should briefly say he takes New Granada, he takes Bogota, and then there's there's a brief truce with the Spanish with Mauricio, who's still in Venezuela at Caracas, and that ends up obviously falling to pieces, really. Partly because this happens, partly because in 1820 you get a rebellion in Spain itself against Ferdinand's, nonsense, and um, he creates the super state, you might call it, of Gran Colombia after the Battle of I believe it's Carabobo in 1821. And so then you get to this whole, okay, we've liberated Venezuela, we've liberated New Granada, now what? Well, I think it's because basically he vowed to rid Latin America of the Spanish, and there are still Spaniards in Latin America. Few people realized how ambitious Bolivar's actual intentions were. He actually meant he wanted to get them all out. And there were royalist holdouts in Quito, Ecuador, and especially Peru, which was a major viceroyalty. But you also have considerations along the lines of while you'd been having this war of liberation in the north, you're also having a war of liberation in the south. Argentina drives it in the south. And I think it's by 1818, the Argentinians have thrown off the Spanish there, and they've been conducting operations based on sending their guy, a guy named probably the finest soldier in Latin America, General San Martin. And he's the liberator of Chile, and he's formed this incredible army called the Ejército de los Andes, and he also marches across the Andes. He does it in 1817, and he does it without losing 2,000 men. He does it. He just does it well. He's a soldier. He gets a logistics train together. He gets a plan together. He just marches across the Andes and does his thing. And he actually marches into Peru in, I think it's 1821, 1822 or something like that. And he declares the independence of Peru. He takes Lima. And this is kind of a little worrying for Bolivar, who he doesn't want to have to deal with a rival republic. His dream is like one big nation, and he'd prefer to gobble up as much land and help as much people out as possible. The threat of San Martin coming in and freeing Peru is not terribly cool unless Bolivar can get in on it. And they have this conference in 1822 where I think he just kind of he's just so much. Bolivar is just so much. He sort of overwhelms San Martin, who's quite a retiring, shy guy who is just a soldier to the core. San Martin was actually at the Battle of Bailen. He was on Castaños's staff, and he removes himself from power after that conference, and he goes into exile. And Bolivar is left with the task of cashing in on the independence of Peru. And he doesn't quite do it himself. He delegates quite a lot to his very able lieutenant and protege, Antonio de Sucre, who wins the Battle of Ayacucho in 1824, and that ensures Peruvian independence. And so basically, it's just the job isn't finished after he creates Gran Colombia, and he adds a lot of states on to it.
I mean, there are so many more questions that we could ask you at this point, aren't there? What I do notice about him is that fundamentally he's a dictator, right? There's no escaping that. But I get the feeling that he ends up going on much longer than he might have liked to, because he does try to resign in 1825, but that gets refused. So, talk us through the last 5 years of his life, because I do get this feeling that he doesn't really get the chance to rest. And in some respects, that might be an element of the problem.
I think it is, yeah. Bolivar was made dictator for life in Peru officially, and he was also given essential. I don't know if they actually made him dictator, but they definitely gave him dictatorial powers in Gran Colombia. The Congress did. Now, to begin with, the term dictator here is best understood in the Roman sense of it. He is the emergency guy who has all the power to do everything while the emergency exists. Unfortunately, these powers are never repealed. And partly this is because Bolivar doesn't think that the people of Latin America are ready for representative democracy. He still believes that you need a single strong man, a popular man, to unite everybody first before you hand it on to what they're trying to do in North America. He said this himself. This was his feeling on the matter. Unfortunately, it basically set the precedent for serving military officers to take power in any of these countries because Bolivar did it. Um, and so, in in addition to that, he doesn't really. The problem is he doesn't actually like politics. He doesn't actually like having to wheel and deal and govern. Although he's not what you might call as professional or even as good a soldier as, say, Napoleon, he prefers soldiering. He he understands that the successes he has had have always derived from taking advantage of his military successes. And so he would often refer to himself as a sort of I'm a simple soldier. I don't get on with all this nonsense that you people want to do. Just do what I tell you. Um, and of course, that isn't massively popular. And he became more and more of an unwanted tyrant, therefore, in the eyes of many. And especially, he started to spend much more time being reclusive. He was also quite ill and spending a lot of money where people thought it shouldn't have been spent. He started to alienate a lot of people, like General Paez, who was left in charge in Venezuela. Um, and because of all this, he's still trying to keep control of everything, trying to keep power in his own hands because he feels that that is the way forward, and at the same time trying. It's so he becomes at war with himself. The reality check seems to come when he's almost assassinated in a coup in Bogota in 1828. He was only saved by the brave actions of his Peruvian mistress Manuela Sanz, and this spurred him to reconsider how secure his position was. And right at the end of his life, a series of blows hit him that kind of just knock him for six. First of all, you get the assassination of General Sucre, um, and he was a very close personal friend, and that was deeply upsetting to him. At this point, he has already actually decided, I'm just giving up. I'm going into exile. If they're going to try and kill me, I've obviously failed. I'm going to go to Europe. I'm going to go to France. That was where San Martin went as well, actually. Um, and then, of course, you also get the fact that General Paez had declared Venezuela independent of Gran Colombia. And so, faced with civil war, the death of his friends, the alienation of his friends, the feeling that he was no longer liked or needed by the people, he just, and the fact he was very, very ill meant that he just gave up for the first time in his life, really. And on his way to exile in 1830, in the winter of 1830, he took ill and, according to his doctors, died of tuberculosis um, at the age of 47.
And there is a controversy over an alleged poisoning, isn't there, that has been disproven. And that's an
Yeah,
important thing to emphasize because we know there are lots of, I mean, when it comes to Napoleon, everybody who wants to believe it loves to do this whole thing of, oh, Napoleon was poisoned and sorry, people, the research has been done and no, that ain't the case. However, I mean, we've talked about comparisons with Napoleon. There's an equivalence ish, if you like, in that there is a poisoning myth that's not true. But where did it come from?
it's kind of difficult to say, to be honest. I've had a little dig around. Apart from the usual sort of things that go on about conspiracy theories regarding his enemies and things like that, there's at the time nobody seemed to think nobody like I say his doctor was pretty much convinced it was tuberculosis. I think it's a semi-modern myth, and it's been particularly promoted by the president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, who has seems to have decided to use it as his own personal something. Is a I don't exactly know why he has hit on this particularly, except that he he himself has almost been assassinated at least once, I believe, and he loves to liken himself to Bolivar. He uses Bolivar as an example for certain things. He likes to use the legacy of Bolivar to do things. And so if he can align himself to being a maligned, forward-thinking genius who has to make the tough decisions just like Simon Bolivar, and he was also assassinated by enemies and things like that, then maybe you can see that I'm actually right, and I should stay in power. And so I think that it's been sort of it resurfaced. Maybe there were rumors at the time. It's very possible um, that it resurfaced basically because Chavez wanted to liken himself further to the founder of to the Libertador, and there was more confusion because there was an American doctor, I believe his name was Doctor Alvorter or something like that, who said that he might have accidentally poisoned himself while treating his illness with basically arsenic poisoning, and that made the story blow up again because people were thinking, "Oh my goodness, an American doctor substantiates this," but actually, while he thinks Bolivar was poisoned, he thinks it was an accidental poisoning, and it's yes, sure, it's technically possible that Bolivar could have been poisoned, but I believe that they found that there was no evidence to suggest really that he had been, and it is one of the sort of it seems to just be now a myth that persists for sort of vague political reasons.
So it seems like an obvious question to ask, but what is Bolivar's legacy?
One of
It
yeah,
seems he gets pulled in all sorts of directions, and you've talked about this already about one individual sort of trying to use him to further a particular agenda, but subsequent and successive governments each try and sort of craft their own Bolivar, don't they?
Bolivar's legacy in Latin America is huge, especially in the northern part. Um, some articles I've read like to say that he's basically second only to Jesus in certain parts of Venezuela, Ecuador, Bogota. It seems to be fairly accurate that Bolivar and the Libertadores, the other liberators of the various countries, are massively central to national identity. If you can trace the creation of your state to Bolivar, then you have an icon ready made to to lend greatness to you, to lend a platform onto which you can stamp your own identity. So this one governor, I think it was the governor of New Granada, who said that wherever Bolivar is, there is the Republic, and I think that is the case for a lot of countries in Latin America. So his legacy is massive. I wouldn't quite hesitate, in fact, to say that it's probably in Latin America, the legacy of Bolivar is greater than Napoleon's in Europe. Napoleon's sort of active legacy is debated as to what did he achieve and what did he not achieve. Bolivar swore to rid Latin America of Spain and create an independent nation. Now, he did fail at a certain level of that, but the Spanish were removed from Latin America largely because of his efforts. So it's very difficult to underemphasize the importance of his legacy to this day, actually.
And finally, we have myths. And I promise this isn't an attempt to try and make you angry, Josh, but I am going to let you have any rant that you wish in your usual sort of mild-mannered way. We do love to bash a myth or two on this show. What myths about Bolivar do you want people to just stick in the bin?
Well, first of all, it's probably wise to kind of treat the poisoning one as somewhat suspect and to look into why people want you to think he was some sort of execution martyr. The other one is just that although he seems to be too good to be true, he seems to be too brilliant. He's, I mean, he seems to be brilliant. He seems to be all these things, right? I don't think that he was as sort of competently brilliant as the legend suggests. For my money, the biggest myth about him was that he could do anything. For instance, I'm much more impressed by General San Martin, who just was, as far as I'm concerned, a better soldier. So the idea of the invincible Bolivar is probably the biggest myth that people should take into account when thinking about him. He was not sort of a perfect individual. He suffers from the same sort of rep as Napoleon. Honestly, he does. Of the man who can do no wrong, who was brought down by traitors, whose vision exceeded those of those around him, and things like that. Sometimes it was just unrealistic. He was also the author of his own downfall. He certainly seemed to lose sight of, his original goals at some point down the line. And he was also, I feel like, a fairly, at times, quite a happy man, whose drive and focus came from a real personal tragedy. So yeah, just try and remember he is a human being rather than the legend.
I think that's a useful approach for pretty much anybody that you're talking about in history. Remember that they were human. Josh, it's been such an interesting run through of somebody who, I'll be honest, I was not well versed in. It's a fascinating story. We did the kind of yo-yo analogy at the start, and I think our listeners will have got a good sense of why he's incredibly complex and why this sort of up and down career is incredibly hard to track. Have you got any suggestions for reading for people who want to follow up?
Yes, The Liberators by Robert Harvey. That's a good one because that one tells you about Miranda, Bolivar, and San Martin, and also it goes into the Mexican War of Independence as well, which is also Latin America is a massive place. Central America had its part to play in this, and the expulsion of the Spanish was not all Bolivar and San Martin. Then we have a very entertaining and well-written biography which is Bolivar, American Liberator by Mauri Arana. And I think those are two good starting points if you'd like to delve in deeper to this subject and to Bolivar's life. I mean, he wrote his own books as well, which are very interesting. And we've scratched the surface on a lot of stuff and had to generalize quite a lot of stuff. And I may have gone down rabbit holes and roads that people may say doesn't know what he's talking about. I do apologize for all of that because this man's life bewilders me. But it is a fascinating life.
It certainly is. Josh, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. You'll be back very soon for some Peninsula War stuff, technical term. I'll look forward to that. But in the meantime, great to see you, buddy.
Happy to be back.
Folks, if you've enjoyed this show, please do me a favor. Head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a 5-star review. If you're not a regular listener, remember to hit that subscribe button so you can find your way back. All of those things are incredibly powerful in helping this show to reach a wider audience. Much love, as ever, to all my Patreon supporters. Shout outs to my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, David Milinski, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals, John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Ned Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, and Jason Morn. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.